Pests and Predator podcast is brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Whether you're a farmer, researcher, or educator, visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can work for you. And welcome to another episode of the Pests and Predator podcast. Today, we're joined by Abbe Pawluk. Abbe, it's great to have you on the Pests and Predator podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Okay, so tell me a bit, but what do you do?
So I just recently graduated with my master's in technically biology, but my focus was entomology, so insects. And yeah, I focused my thesis primarily on integrated pest management, so different ways that we can control pest populations while minimizing our use of pesticides. So kind of trying to find that nice balance between conserving biodiversity while also making sure that we have agricultural productivity. My thesis itself focused on something called the parasitoid hymenopteron, or the group called parasitoid hymenopterans. These are parasitoid wasps. If you want to pronounce it a little bit easier, that's an easier way to think of it. And my thesis focused on how different types of edge boundaries around fields, so different types of habitats that you would find around fields, might influence their diversity and promote them.
Great stuff. And so where are you working?
I was working at Agriculture Agri-Food right now, and at the moment I'm just interviewing for a couple of research positions all around Canada focused in entomology.
Nice. Well, we definitely need more great entomologists. So it's great to meet you and have you focused in a very, very important field to farmers across the country indeed. So you mentioned those parasitoid wasps. I guess let's talk about what they are and what is their importance in agriculture.
Yeah, so the best way to think of a parasitoid wasp or a parasitoid hymenopteron is to break apart the word into its original component. So parasitoid is an insect or an organism, really, it doesn't have to be an insect, that attacks another organism and will lay its eggs like in or on this other organism. And from there, the eggs will grow and it'll kill the original host. So in more simpler terms, you might have a wasp, which is what I look at, and they'll attack another bug or perhaps a plant. They'll lay their eggs in it, and as the eggs grow, the plant or the other bug will always die. So it's different from a parasite, where parasites, they continue to live on after the eggs have been deposited. A parasitoid will always kill its host. And Hymenopteron, the second part, which is wasps, it's a large order of insects. It includes wasps, bees, ants. I look at the wasp specifically. So oftentimes when you think about a wasp, you might think of a yellow jacket, the big, scary, stinging guys. But in reality, most wasps are actually very tiny. They're about generally, around a couple millimeters in size, and you don't really notice them in your everyday life, but they're highly abundant. They often have something called an ovipositor, which, sorry to get into the biology, I'm super
That's
excited
great.
about
It's
this.
super interesting. Go ahead. No, it's awesome.
They often have something, or they do have something called an ovipositor, which looks like a stinger in a traditional wasp. So you might see like this big scary insect that has this really long stinger, but in fact, that's its ovipositor. That's what it uses to deposit its eggs into its host. And they can't sting. Most of them actually can't physically sting. They don't have the ability to do it. So yeah, that's what I study. It's this kind of really large class of really unknown insects for the most part. The general population isn't really familiar with them, but they're very, very common. And in agriculture, we really like them because of this life cycle trait of being able to kill their host. So in agriculture, we can use them to essentially target problem pests that might have insecticide resistance, or maybe you're an organic farmer and you don't really want to use insecticides, or you're just a regular producer and you want to minimize your insecticide use, right?
Yeah.
So that's why we generally like them.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so are there common types and what kinds of things are they targeting?
So like I said, they're so small often, so you don't really notice them, but they do target a lot of really common pests. So I looked really heavily into a group called Peristennis. So Peristennis wasps target ligas. They're very good at it. Here in southern Alberta, where I am, we have 3 different species that essentially target ligas all throughout their life cycle. So it's really convenient, or throughout their growing cycle, I think is a better way to put it. There's also Brachycephaly, which targets wheat stem softfly.
Yep.
There's Cotesia, which targets everything. You could cutworms, cabbage loopers, armyworms, diamondback moths, everything. So they have a wide range of what they go after.
Okay, so in your research, you focused on three specific edge types. So I would like to hear the why of that, and how do those three types differ?
So, like I mentioned in my thesis, I was looking at how different edge boundaries or edge types around agricultural fields might influence parasitoid diversity. Because the more parasitoids you have, right, the better it is. You have better pest control, you have better agriculture and ecological balance going on. Um, so I looked at three different types of edge types. One of them is road verges. So it's essentially just those little strips of land right beside roads. Sometimes they get mowed during, the summer growing season. And then I also looked at shelter belts, which are rows of trees that are traditionally planted in order to act as windbreaks. They're not that common anymore. People are not planting them as often, so they're a little bit hard to find in my study, but I did look at those. And then finally, I looked at something coulees. So if you're in southern Alberta, you're familiar with coulees. They're
Yep.
these really large, vast expanses of natural land, river running through them. And I looked at them because I wanted to see if you had something what I considered a lower quality habitat, so your road verges, and then a medium quality habitat, your shelter belts, and then a high quality habitat, which would be your coulees. I want to see if maybe you would have greater diversity in coulees, for example, where you have so much more natural land. They're not mowed regularly like road verges are. Um, or maybe if parasitoids prefer, shelter belts, and if they probably prefer, the tree cover that comes with it. So I just wanted to see what was going on at these different kind of quality habitats that I was looking at.
Yeah, and so talk a little bit about like how much influence did the habitat how much influence did that have on some of the diversity?
Yeah. So in my mind, I was thinking that, like I mentioned, road verges would have minimal influence, and then coulees would have the most influence on diversity. And by that, I mean uh, diversity. I was measuring the total number of insects that you found, parasitoids that you found, and the different species that you found. And I found that there was absolutely no difference between all of the habitats I looked at,
Really?
which was really surprising. Yeah, it was really
Yeah.
surprising. Um, so I was really shocked to find that. Absolutely no difference between all of them based on pretty much all of my diversity measurements. Uh, so in general, I actually found diversity was kind of low when I was measuring at these sites. I mean, I didn't really have another comparison of like different sites I was looking at outside of these three edge styles. But I found diversity of parasitoids generally was much lower based on different diversity indices and like calculations you would look at.
Hmm.
So I found them to be relatively low, which was a little sad.
So was in essence then there was really no factors that were driving
Yeah,
diversity then?
correct. So at least in terms of edge type. However, there was a different factor that I did find in my study, kind of afterwards when I was looking at all of my data compiled. I did find that there was a huge difference in diversity based on the different types or the different farms I would look at. So I had 15 sites spread out across, I think, 6 or 7 farms,
Hmm.
and the diversity for each farm differed quite a bit, but the diversity in terms of fields owned by each farm did not change. So that tells me that within farms, probably maybe farming practices could have been driving different diversity rather than, surrounding natural area, which is what I was thinking. I don't have proof of this. This is just a future study I'd really like to conduct. But because you saw this huge difference between, farm A and farm B, and farm A was very adamantly no-till and, absolutely only sprayed when they had to, and all of these different attributes, and farm B, did till regularly, did spray, somewhat regularly, or when they felt that it was needed to be. I did find that farming practices maybe played a big difference, at least differences in farms did.
Wow. Okay, so what
Yeah.
role could non-crop habitats play in promoting biodiversity and some of these agroecosystems if the direct influence on parasitoids, wasps is so minimal then?
Yeah. Good question. Because originally I was thinking that these non-crop habitats, right, these natural land areas would play such a role in diversity. It's hard to say, oh, they're so good for these parasitoids because we want parasitoids in our fields. But just because I didn't find a difference doesn't mean you should be mowing over, your coulee sites or you should be cutting down all of your shelter belts or anything like that. These non-crop habitats still have really important aspects for the agro ecosystem itself, so the health of the agro ecosystem. They sequester carbon. They keep carbon in the ground. They also help with water retention. So when I would be working at my shelter belt sites, for example, I would find that the canola I was working in was always so much more tall and lush
Mm,
right at the edge near the canola because they would have so much extra water that it could get, especially in like dry land. Um, so it also provides habitat for other beneficial insects. So just because it doesn't provide habitat from my study, or sorry, it doesn't promote diversity from my study for the specific parasitoid that I was looking at, it still could provide habitat for them as well as for,
mm.
carabid beetles or arachnids or, any other kind of beneficial insect you can think of.
So cool. Okay, now you collected, or I guess you found that 70% of your collected specimens were from one species, and what was that?
Yeah, so part of my study, I was, of course, collecting all my parasitoids and I was trying to identify them to species if I could, but most of them were identified to genus. And I was just trying to also see what was in our fields, because we actually, in southern Alberta, we don't really know what is in our fields at all.
Mm,
My study was one of the first to kind of compile a list of parasitoids that we do find in southern Alberta, because we just had no clue. It wasn't studied because they're just so itty bitty and small and people forget about them. Um, and so the most common genus that I found was a genus called Dialcogaster, and specifically it came from a species called Dialcogaster claritibia. And this is an exotic species. It's not originally from Canada. It was first reported in Canada in 2014. It's
hmm,
originally from Europe, and we have absolutely no clue how it got here. It
really?
just showed up. No clue. There's some running theories, but it's still not confirmed. So it showed up in our fields around 20, well, earlier than 2014, but first reported in 2014. And from my sample collection, this was from 2023, 70% of my samples were Dalcogaster claritibia. And so it's good on one end because it's a beneficial insect. It attacks diamondback moths, right? But on the other end, it could be influencing native parasitoids. So it's kind of a mixture of like, is this good? Is this bad? The good news is it's probably doing really well at controlling diamondback populations. So yeah, it was a
Okay.
surprising result. I wasn't expecting to find just an exotic species dominating southern Alberta, fields like that.
Yeah, especially when we don't know how it got here. That's kind of mysterious. That sounds like some future research for you to be doing. Now, does it pose any risks then?
To anything but diamondback moth, probably not. It
Okay.
could be pushing out native species, but we don't know because there's no background research on this. Again, I did one of the first kind of research studies that looked at the composition of parasitoids in our fields.
Hmm.
So if there had been a previous study that maybe, someone had done 10 years prior of, parasitoids in our fields, I could look back and reference and say, there was only, 5% of the samples here that were Dalcogaster claritibia. Then I could say, yeah, it's pushing out other native insects. You know, it's probably over dominating, but because we don't know, it's hard to say.
Cool. Okay, a question for you. Now, you've completed this research. There's a lot more to do in trying to understand parasitoids. Where are some of the gaps in some of this research in Canada, and how do you think we should be addressing them?
I mean, going back to my original comment on needing to go back and research Dialcogaster, right? That's a big one. Where
Right.
did it come
Yeah.
from? Would be really good to know, especially if it's so abundant in our field. I have like a little pool of water outside my house sometimes for my dogs to play in, and like I'll just look in and see what bugs have fallen in, and I can just see these Dialcogaster just in this pool dead. So many. So figuring out where this species came from and are they pushing out native insects is one. Another one is figuring out if land management practices are the major driver in parasitoid diversity, right?
Mm.
Because that's just a guess on my part based on the minimal information I have. It could be other factors like landscape scale. Is your farm closer to a large body of water? And does that influence, how many parasitoids you're getting? Is your farm closer to, an urban area, and does that lower how many parasitoids that you're getting? So figuring out if it's farm management, so how much you till, your irrigation style, your pesticide use, things like that, or is it something larger, something bigger that you can't really help? So figuring that out, and then also continuing these studies and figuring out what our fields or what's in our fields. Um, my study focused only in canola, and so it'd be really good to know, what's going on in alfalfa, what's going on, maybe in like corn or even in barley or something like
Yeah.
that.
Cool. Okay, so to wrap up here, what message or I don't know insights would you like listeners? There's researchers, some of your colleagues, farmers, of course, and other people that are listening to this. What do you want them to take away from your study?
Um, I have like a couple. I stand on my soapbox for this one. First, wasps are not bad. They're not scary. Most wasps don't sting, and if you see a wasp with a really long stinger, it's not a stinger and it won't hurt you. And
Says you,
it's
says
super.
you.
I promise, I pinky promise. There's a couple that can sting, and I got stung by one and felt kind of like blessed because it's so rare. Um, my other one is, just because our natural landscapes or the natural landscapes bordering fields, at least in terms of my study, aren't promoting these parasitoid hymenopterans, promoting these beneficial insects,
Mm.
doesn't mean you should stop planting, shelter belts, and doesn't mean you should stop, you know, maintaining these natural areas. It's still really important for the overall health of your ecosystem, of the agriculture around it, right? It's always going to be beneficial. And so, you know, just because you don't see major benefits initially with it, you should always keep maintaining these natural areas. And finally, I think we should really, if anyone is interested in insects, I strongly suggest you go into studying these parasitoid wasps. They are so understudied and yet they're so abundant. And all of the entomologists I talk
Mm.
to aren't very familiar with them, or if they are, it's on a very surface level. And so we need more people who are interested in just this beautiful, ginormous group of wasps that help, producers, that help, the ecosystem. We need them, and we need people looking after them.
Well, Abby, thanks so much for joining us here today on the Pest and Predator podcast. It's great to meet you and wish you all the best in the future as an entomologist.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Pest and Predator podcast. It's brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm.